The humid summer air hung thick and heavy over Oakwood, clinging to everything like a damp shroud. Cicadas buzzed their relentless symphony, a soundtrack to the languid afternoon. Marcus walked down Elm Street, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps, echoing softly against the cracked concrete sidewalk. He knew every uneven patch, every faded storefront, every rustle of leaves in the ancient oaks that gave the neighborhood its name. Oakwood was his anchor, his sanctuary, the place where he felt most authentically himself. He was heading to Mrs. Henderson's bakery, a small, unassuming shop tucked between a bustling barber shop and a vibrant mural depicting the neighborhood's history. The scent of cinnamon and warm bread always drew him in, a comforting aroma that spoke of home and community. He was meeting Mrs. Henderson to finalize details for the annual Oakwood Community Picnic, a cherished tradition he'd helped organize for years. Marcus wasn't just a resident of Oakwood, he was woven into its very fabric. A professor of sociology at the nearby state university, he dedicated his life to understanding and uplifting communities like his own. His lectures were legendary, not just for their intellectual rigor but for their passionate delivery and genuine care for his students. He encouraged them to look beyond textbooks, to engage with the world, to understand the complex tapestry of human experience. He brought that same passion to Oakwood, volunteering at the local youth center, mentoring young men, and tirelessly advocating for better resources for the neighborhood. Today, however, a subtle unease pricked at the edges of his usual calm. There was a tension in the air, a low hum of anxiety that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of the summer heat. He'd noticed it earlier that morning, a curt exchange between neighbors, a police car lingering a little too long on a corner, the way people's eyes seemed to dart around, searching, anticipating something unseen. He dismissed it as neighborhood jitters, the kind that ebbed and flowed with the city's pulse. But as he rounded the corner onto Elm Street, the unease solidified into a cold knot in his stomach. 2 police cruisers were parked haphazardly in front of Mrs. Henderson's bakery, their flashing blue and red lights slicing through the afternoon sunlight, casting an unsettling strobe effect on the quiet street. A small crowd had gathered, a murmuring knot of onlookers, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The familiar scent of cinnamon was overpowered by something acrid, something metallic that stung his nostrils. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble as he approached the edge of the crowd. A woman he recognized from the community garden, Mrs. Rodriguez, turned to him, her eyes wide with distress. They took someone, Marcus, right out of the bakery." "Took who?" His heart began to pound a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know. Just 2 officers. They went in, there was shouting, and then they dragged him out. He was struggling." Marcus pushed gently through the crowd, his gaze fixed on the open doorway of the bakery. The cheerful yellow awning seemed to mock the grim scene unfolding. He could see 2 police officers inside, their backs to him, their postures rigid and authoritative. Mrs. Henderson stood behind the counter, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. He took a step forward, his voice rising slightly. "Officers, what's happening here?" One of the officers turned, his face obscured by sunglasses and a stern, unyielding expression. He was young, barely out of his 20s, with a tightly cropped haircut and a uniform that looked too crisp, too new. "Stay back, sir. Police business." Police business? In Mrs. Henderson's bakery? What business could possibly require this kind of presence? Marcus's voice was calm, but a thread of steel ran through it. He was a man accustomed to being listened to being respected, to being seen as an authority in his own right. The officer scoffed, a dismissive sound that grated on Marcus's nerves. "Just move along, sir. We're handling it." "Handling what? You haven't told me anything. People are concerned. This is a community bakery, not a crime scene." The second officer, larger and more imposing, stepped forward. He was older, his face weathered and hard, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You got a problem, buddy. You fit the description." "Description? Description of what?" Marcus felt a surge of anger, hot and sudden. This was it. This was the feeling he'd sensed in the air, the unspoken fear that simmered beneath the surface of everyday life in Oakwood. He knew this description. He'd lived with it his entire life. Just a description, the older officer repeated, his voice laced with contempt. Now step aside and let us do our job. My job is to understand what's happening in my community, and right now it looks like you're harassing a local business and terrorizing residents. I have a right to know what's going on. Marcus stood his ground, his body radiating a quiet defiance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a gaze that could hold steady under pressure. He was not easily intimidated. The younger officer smirked. Right to know? You got rights, huh? Let's see how many rights you got when you're on the ground. Before Marcus could react, the older officer moved with surprising speed. He grabbed Marcus's arm, his grip like iron, and twisted it behind his back. A sharp pain shot up Marcus's shoulder, a jolt of pure, unexpected agony. Hey, what are you doing? Marcus cried out, his voice laced with shock and pain. Resisting arrest, the older officer grunted, his breath hot and stale on Marcus's neck. Another one resisting arrest. They never learn. I'm not resisting. I'm asking a question. Marcus struggled, his body instinctively reacting against the sudden aggression. The younger officer joined in, grabbing Marcus's other arm, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. They shoved him forward, pushing him roughly against the hood of one of the cruisers. The metal was hot against his cheek, the flashing lights reflecting in his eyes, blurring his vision. Spread 'em, the older officer barked, his voice harsh and dehumanizing. Marcus tried to maintain his composure, to reason with them, but words seemed to fail him. The sudden, brutal escalation of the situation had left him reeling. He was a professor, a community leader, a respected member of society. He was not a criminal. He had done nothing wrong. Yet here he was, pinned against a police car, being treated like a common thug. The injustice of it was a physical blow, a crushing weight on his chest. He felt their hands patting him down, rough and impersonal, violating his space, his dignity. He could hear the murmur of the crowd behind him, the gasps and whispers, the collective intake of breath as they witnessed this unfolding spectacle. You're making a mistake, Marcus managed to say, his voice strained. You have no idea who I am. The younger officer chuckled, a cruel, mocking sound. Oh, we know exactly who you are. Just another punk trying to cause trouble. The older officer tightened, his grip on Marcus's arms, his voice low and menacing. You're going downtown. We'll sort you out there. They pulled him away from the car, roughly pushing him towards the open door of the cruiser. Marcus stumbled, his legs momentarily unsteady. He caught a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson's face, her eyes filled with tears, her mouth moving silently, as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. As they shoved him into the back of the cruiser, the hard plastic seat digging into his spine, Marcus looked back at the crowd. He saw faces he knew, faces he'd smiled at, faces he'd helped, faces that now reflected his own shock and disbelief. He saw Mrs. Rodriguez, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. He saw young men he'd mentored, there, faces tight with anger and fear, and then the door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the humid air. The flashing lights outside blurred into streaks of red and blue as the cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving behind the familiar streets of Oakwood, the scent of cinnamon, and the shattered illusion of safety and justice. He was being driven away, a black man in handcuffs, a victim of a system that was supposed to protect him, but had instead turned on him with brutal, unthinking force. He had no idea where they were taking him, or what awaited him, but one thing was terrifyingly clear. This was just the beginning. Marcus frowned, his anger momentarily overshadowed by a flicker of apprehension. Complicates things? What are you talking about? Detective Miller hesitated again, as if choosing her words carefully. Do you have any family in Washington, Mr. Johnson? Any prominent relatives? Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. Washington? Prominent relatives? He had family scattered across the country like most people did, but Prominent? He couldn't think of anyone. Except a long-buried memory surfaced. A faded photograph. A whispered story from his childhood. His mother. Her voice hushed and secretive, talking about a brother, a half-brother who had left their lives long ago, who had gone far. Too far to reach. Too far to remember. She'd never spoken of him again, the subject shrouded in a veil of unspoken sadness and regret. I don't know, Marcus stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. My mother, she mentioned something a long time ago. A brother. A half-brother. But I don't know anything about him. Detective Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. Your mother's name was Eleanor Johnson, correct? Yes, Marcus said, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor Johnson. Why? What does this have to do with anything? Detective Miller opened the file again, pulling out a different document. She slid it across the table towards Marcus. It was a photograph, a recent photograph, from a newspaper or magazine. A picture of a man in a suit standing at a podium addressing a crowd. A familiar face, yet strangely distant, almost unreal. Marcus picked up the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. He stared at the face, his breath catching in his throat. It was him. It was undeniably him. But older, sharper, more presidential. The man in the photograph was President Thomas Thompson. He looked up at Detective Miller, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning comprehension. That's impossible. Detective Miller simply nodded, her expression grave. It's not impossible, Mr. Johnson. President Thompson is your half-brother. Eleanor Johnson was his mother, too. Before she married your father. The room seemed to spin around Marcus. President Thompson, his half-brother, the President of the United States, the man whose face was plastered across every newspaper, every television screen, every corner of the world. His brother. This changes everything, Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. It does, Detective Miller agreed. The officers who arrested you, they had no idea who you were. They acted on a flawed description, and their actions were clearly excessive and unwarranted. But the fact that you are the president's brother, it elevates this situation. To a whole new level. Elevates? Marcus repeated, his voice rising again. It doesn't elevate anything. It just makes it even more absurd. I was assaulted because I'm black, because I fit their racist profile. My connection to the president shouldn't change that. Justice should be blind. Of course, Mr. Johnson, Detective Miller said calmly. Justice should be blind. But reality is rarely so simple. This incident, it has the potential to become a national scandal. It could have significant political ramifications. And it could put you in a very difficult position. Marcus stared at the photograph again, the president's face now seeming to mock him, to judge him, to remind him of a past he never knew, a family he never had. He had been living his life, fighting for justice, for equality, for his community, oblivious to this hidden connection, this secret history. And now, it had exploded into his life, shattering his carefully constructed world, threatening to engulf him in a storm of media attention, political maneuvering, and unimaginable pressure. He suddenly felt incredibly weary, the weight of the day, the weight of this revelation pressing down on him, suffocating him. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, trying to process the impossible truth. He was Marcus Johnson, professor, community leader, advocate for justice. And he was also, inexplicably, the president's brother. And his life, he knew, would never be the same again. The shadows of doubt had deepened, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, fear, and the daunting weight of a truth he never asked for, never expected, and never could have imagined. The news spread like wildfire. A local news outlet, tipped off by an anonymous source within the police department, broke the story late that night. Local professor arrested in Oakwood incident, shocking twist. Victim is President Thompson's brother. The headline screamed across screens and newspapers, igniting a media frenzy that exploded across the nation. Suddenly, Marcus Johnson was no longer just a professor, no longer just a victim of police brutality. He was the president's brother, the forgotten brother, the secret brother, the black brother. The narrative twisted and turned, fueled by speculation, misinformation, and political opportunism. Cable news channels ran non-stop coverage, dissecting every angle of the story. Pundits debated the implications for the president, for race relations, for the upcoming election. Social media erupted in a cacophony of outrage, support, conspiracy theories, and racist vitriol. President brother, justice for Marcus, Oakwood assault, Thompson secret, hashtags trended globally, each click amplifying the story's reach and intensity. The White House press secretary held a hastily arranged press conference, her face pale and strained as she read a carefully worded statement. President Thompson was deeply concerned by the allegations of police misconduct. He believed in equal justice for all and had full faith in the ongoing investigation. He was unaware of the familial connection until recently and was processing this personal revelation. The statement was vague, evasive, and did little to quell the storm. Meanwhile, Marcus remained in the hospital, under police guard, ostensibly for his own protection, but he felt more like a prisoner. He was overwhelmed, bombarded by calls from lawyers, activists, journalists, and even distant relatives he'd never known existed. He refused to speak to anyone, retreating into himself, trying to make sense of the chaos engulfing his life. His phone buzzed incessantly with text messages, emails, and voicemails. One message stood out, a number he didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Detective Miller. "Mr. Johnson, you need to see this. Turn on Channel 7 News." Now, he reluctantly reached for the remote and switched on the television. Channel 7 News was broadcasting live from the steps of City Hall. Mayor Thompson, no relation, the anchor clarified dryly, was holding a press conference. He was flanked by the police chief and the district attorney, their faces grim and serious. "This morning," Mayor Thompson began, his voice somber, "our city was rocked by the revelation of a deeply troubling incident, an incident that has shaken our faith in the principles of justice and equality that we hold so dear." Marcus watched, his heart pounding in his chest, a cold dread creeping over him. He knew what was coming. "The video footage of the arrest of Mr. Marcus Johnson is deeply disturbing," the mayor continued. "The actions of Officers Ramirez and Davies were unacceptable, unprofessional, and a clear violation of police procedure and basic human decency. There is no justification for the level of force used, and their conduct will not be tolerated in this city." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled reporters. The mayor paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Therefore," he announced, his voice firm and resolute, "effective immediately, Officers Ramirez and Davies have been terminated from the police department. Furthermore, the district attorney has informed me that he will be initiating a criminal investigation into their actions, with the full intention of pursuing charges of assault, battery, and abuse of power." A roar erupted from the reporters, a barrage of questions and shouted demands for clarification. The mayor held up his hand, silencing them. "We understand that this is just the first step," he said. "We know that this incident has exposed deep-seated issues of racial bias and police accountability within our department, and within our society as a whole. We are committed to addressing these issues head-on, to implementing meaningful reforms, and to ensuring that justice is served for Mr. Johnson and for all members of our community." Marcus stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Terminated? Criminal investigation? This was more than he expected, more than he dared to hope for. The public outcry, the media attention, the political pressure, it had worked. It had forced them to act, to acknowledge the truth, to hold the officers accountable. But something was still missing. Something crucial. The president. His brother. He hadn't heard a word from him directly, only the carefully crafted statements from his press secretary. He felt a deep ache of disappointment, a sense of abandonment, a longing for connection that he couldn't quite articulate. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He had a voice, a platform, a responsibility, not just to himself, but to his community, to everyone who had been subjected to the same kind of injustice, the same kind of dehumanization. He called Detective Miller back. "I want to speak," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "I want to hold a press conference, tomorrow morning." Detective Miller was hesitant. "Mr. Johnson, are you sure? This is going to be intense. The media attention is already overwhelming." "I'm sure," Marcus said. "It's time for the truth to be told. All of it." The next morning, the hospital conference room was packed. Reporters, cameras, microphones. A chaotic sea of media personnel pressed against the barriers, their energy palpable, their anticipation electric. Marcus walked slowly to the podium, leaning slightly on a cane, his shoulder still bandaged, his face pale but resolute. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, his presence radiating a quiet dignity and strength. He looked out at the assembled crowd, his gaze sweeping across the faces, searching, connecting. He saw concern, curiosity, skepticism, and even a flicker of hope in some eyes. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he said, his voice clear and strong, resonating through the room. "2 days ago, I was walking down the street in my neighborhood, Oakwood, when I was brutally assaulted and falsely arrested by 2 police officers. The video footage of that assault has been seen by millions, and the officers responsible have been terminated and are now under criminal investigation." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. "But this is not just about me," he continued. "This is about Oakwood. This is about every community, every person of color who has been subjected to police brutality, to racial profiling, to the systemic injustice that plagues our nation. This is about the harsh realities of discrimination that we face every single day." He spoke for several minutes, his voice filled with passion and pain, sharing his experience, his anger, his determination to fight for change. He spoke about Oakwood, about its resilience, its spirit, its need for resources and respect. He spoke about the need for police reform, for accountability, for genuine community policing. And then, he paused again, his gaze becoming more intense, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. "There's one more thing I need to say," he said. "Something that has been revealed in the past 24 hours, something that adds another layer of complexity to this already tragic situation." The room held its breath. The silence was deafening. "My mother," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly. "Eleanor Johnson. She had another son before me. A son she gave up for adoption many years ago." He paused, looking directly into the cameras, his eyes locking with the millions watching across the nation. "That son," he said, his voice ringing with emotion and revelation, "is President Thomas Thompson." A collective gasp swept through the room, a wave of shock and disbelief rippling through the media frenzy. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for their microphones, the room erupted in a cacophony of noise and confusion. Marcus held up his hand, silencing the uproar. "Yes," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "President Thompson is my brother, my half-brother. We share the same mother. We never knew each other until now." He looked down at the podium, his shoulders slumping slightly. The weight of the revelation, the weight of the moment, finally catching up to him. He had unveiled the truth, exposed the secret, shattered the silence. The climax had arrived, the drastic action taken. The world now knew, and the aftermath, he knew, would be unpredictable, tumultuous, and life-altering. The unveiling was complete, and the consequences were about to unfold. The aftermath of Marcus's press conference was a whirlwind. The revelation of his relationship to the president sent shockwaves through the political landscape and the national consciousness. The story dominated headlines for days, eclipsing all other news. The media frenzy intensified, now fueled by the unprecedented intersection of police brutality, racial injustice, and presidential scandal. President Thompson, initially silent, released a second, more personal statement. He confirmed the family connection, expressing deep shock and regret at the assault on his brother. He announced that he had spoken to Marcus personally and had offered his unwavering support. He pledged to launch a national task force on police reform and racial justice, promising meaningful and lasting change. The political fallout was immediate and intense. Opponents accused the president of hypocrisy, of exploiting his brother's suffering for political gain. Supporters rallied to his defense, praising his swift response and commitment to reform. The nation was deeply divided, the fault lines of race, class, and political affiliation starkly exposed. In Oakwood, the community erupted in a mixture of outrage and pride. Outrage at the brutality Marcus had endured, pride in his courage and eloquence. Protests erupted, peaceful but powerful, demanding justice for Marcus and an end to police brutality. Mrs. Henderson's bakery became a focal point, a symbol of resistance and community solidarity. Marcus, still recovering in the hospital, found himself at the center of a national movement. He became a reluctant icon, a symbol of hope and resilience. He received an outpouring of support from across the country and around the world. Letters, emails, flowers, gifts, tokens of solidarity and admiration flooded his hospital room. President Thompson, despite the political risks, made the unprecedented decision to visit Marcus in the hospital. The meeting was private, no media allowed, just two brothers, meeting for the first time under the most extraordinary and painful circumstances. The details of their conversation remained confidential, but sources later revealed that it was a deeply emotional and tense encounter. Years of separation, unspoken resentments, and the weight of their shared history hung heavy in the air. Marcus confronted his brother directly, expressing his anger and disappointment at the systemic racism that had led to his assault, at the silence and distance of their shared past. President Thompson, visibly shaken, listened intently, offering apologies and acknowledging the pain he had caused, both personally and politically. He spoke of his own struggles, his own journey, his regret at not knowing about Marcus sooner. He vowed to use his power and platform to fight for justice and equality, to honor Marcus's suffering, and to make amends for the failures of the past. The meeting lasted for hours, a raw and honest exchange between two men grappling with a lifetime of separation and the sudden brutal reality of their connection. By the time President Thompson left the hospital, a fragile bridge had been built between them, a tentative step towards reconciliation. The criminal investigation into Officers Ramirez and Davies proceeded swiftly. The video evidence was overwhelming, and public pressure was immense. Both officers were formally charged with assault and battery, and faced the prospect of prison time. The police department announced a series of reforms, including mandatory body cameras, de-escalation training, and community oversight boards. The National Task Force on Police Reform, launched by President Thompson, began its work, holding public hearings across the country, listening to community leaders, activists, and victims of police brutality. Marcus, though still recovering, agreed to serve as an advisor to the task force, lending his voice and experience to the effort. The initial shock and fury began to subside, replaced by a more somber and reflective mood. The ripples of the Oakwood incident spread outwards, forcing a national conversation about race, justice, and the role of law enforcement in society. The consequences of the climax were unfolding, not just in the legal and political realms, but in the hearts and minds of individuals across the nation. The cooling down process had begun, but the embers of anger and the promise of change still glowed brightly, waiting to be fanned into a lasting flame. The nation watched, waited, and wondered if this unbelievable incident, born out of brutality and ignorance, could truly bring about the lessons and the justice it so desperately demanded. Months passed. The trial of Officers Ramirez and Davies became a national spectacle, televised and closely followed. The prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the video evidence and Marcus's powerful testimony. The defense attempted to argue self-defense and misidentification, but the jury ultimately saw through the flimsy excuses. Both officers were found guilty on all counts and sentenced to significant prison terms. Justice, in this instance, was served. The police reforms, initiated by the city and the nation, began to take root. Body cameras became standard issue, de-escalation training was implemented, and community oversight boards gained real power. Progress was slow and uneven, resistance persistent, but a shift was undeniable. The conversation about police accountability and racial justice was no longer confined to activist circles. It had entered the mainstream, forcing a reckoning with systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. President Thompson, despite the political risks, continued to champion police reform and racial equality. He faced fierce opposition, but he remained steadfast, driven by a newfound personal conviction. His relationship with Marcus, though still evolving, became a source of strength and inspiration for him. He publicly acknowledged his brother's influence, often citing Marcus's insights and experiences in his speeches and policy initiatives. Marcus, having recovered physically, though still bearing the emotional scars of the assault, emerged as a national voice for change. He used his platform to advocate for police reform, community investment, and racial justice. He founded the Oakwood Justice Initiative, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting communities affected by police brutality and systemic racism. He traveled the country, speaking at rallies, universities, and community forums, sharing his story and inspiring others to action. 1 year after the assault, the Oakwood Community Picnic was held again, bigger and more meaningful than ever. The atmosphere was celebratory, but also reflective, a recognition of the pain and the progress of the past year. Marcus stood on a makeshift stage, addressing the crowd, his voice filled with gratitude and hope. "Oakwood," he said, his gaze sweeping across the familiar faces. "We have been through a storm. We have faced darkness and injustice. But we have also shown our strength, our resilience, our unwavering spirit. We have shown the world that even in the face of brutality, hope can endure, justice can be found, and community can heal." As he spoke, a figure emerged from the crowd walking towards the stage. It was President Thompson. The crowd gasped, then erupted in applause. President Thompson climbed onto the stage, embraced Marcus warmly, and stood beside him, a silent symbol of solidarity and reconciliation. "I came to Oakwood today," President Thompson said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "Not just as president, but as a brother. To stand with Marcus, to stand with this community, to stand for justice and equality for all." He spoke briefly, passionately, reaffirming his commitment to reform, to healing, to building a more just and equitable nation. Then, he stepped back, letting Marcus take center stage again. Marcus looked at his brother, a flicker of genuine warmth passing between them. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, faces filled with hope and determination. He saw Mrs. Henderson, smiling through tears, offering him a warm cinnamon roll. He saw Mrs. Rodriguez beaming with pride. He saw the young men he mentored, standing tall and confident, ready to carry the torch forward. The echoes of the brutality in Oakwood would never fully fade, but they were now intertwined with echoes of hope, echoes of justice, echoes of humanity. The main conflicts were not entirely resolved. Systemic racism was a deep-rooted issue, but progress had been made, lessons had been learned, and a path towards healing and change had been forged. The final emotions were complex: sorrow, anger, but also resilience, hope, and a profound sense of connection. The message was clear. Even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, justice can be pursued, and humanity can prevail. The sincere and passionate storytelling of their lives individually and collectively had just begun.